Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session of Embrace Aging. My name is Joan Batorf, and I'm delighted to welcome you on a Friday afternoon. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm gathering here, and we're gathering, at least some of us today, is here at UBC Okanagan, which we're delighted to be on the traditional unceded territory of the Silk Okanagan Nation and their people. And I know that some of you might be joining us from other places. And so I also want to acknowledge the owners of those traditional lands as well, both past and present. As I said, my name is Joan Batorf. I'm a professor in the School of Nursing and director of the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention here at UBC Okanagan. It's really a delight to welcome you to our 8th annual Okanagan Embrace Aging Month. Embrace Aging is co-hosted by 3 partners: the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention, Interior Health, and Interior Savings. We launched this month of Embracing Aging 8 years ago to celebrate and raise awareness about positive aging in our community. And as you've noticed, if you've been attending some of our events, we've organized quite a range of educational opportunities over the month of March. The sessions are really designed for everyone, young and old, and they focus on a wide variety of topics related to healthy aging and to improve quality of life for everyone. Our goal is to inspire healthy aging. And our session today is no exception in terms of an event that's really focused on everyone. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a closed captioning box, and you can move it to your preferred location on your screen, or you can turn off the closed captioning if you find that it's distracting or not useful. With the menu bar on the bottom of your screen, you'll find a little button called Live Transcript, and you can turn it off using that button. We will have time for questions and comments at the end of the presentation, and we welcome you to use the chat box to put any comments and questions at any time during the session, and we'll read them out at the end of the presentation. So today's presentation is really an important one because it's World Sleep Day, a day to really recognize the importance of sleep. And so I'm delighted to welcome Paige Copeland, a Master of Science student in the School of Health and Exercise Science in the Faculty of Health and Social Development here at UBC Okanagan, and a member of our Embrace Aging Planning Committee to present today's session, Sleeping Better for Fall Prevention. Over to you, Paige. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the introduction, Joan. As she said, my name is Paige Copeland, a Master's of Science student at UBCO in the School of Health and Exercise Sciences. And today I will be talking about sleeping better for fall prevention. Oops. Bear with me through any technical difficulties that might pop up. But also similar to what Joan said, I just wanted to wish everybody a happy World Sleep Day. World Sleep Day is an annual event hosted by the World Sleep Society, and it's intended to be a celebration of sleep and a call to action on important issues related to sleep. World Sleep Day also aims to lessen the burden of sleep problems on society through better prevention and management of sleep disorders. Before I get into the presentation, I thought I would introduce myself a little bit more. So I was born and raised in Armstrong, British Columbia, home of the Okanagan cheesemakers. And throughout my childhood and into adulthood, I've always had a love for sport and activity. Mostly through dance and things like basketball and volleyball when I was younger. And then within the last few years, I've actually sort of found a new love for hiking and getting to see these really cool spots, as you can see in the picture here. I've also grown up having a really fond passion for the human body and how the brain and spinal cord can sort of work together to allow us to have these really cool movements that we're able to do. And because of all of those things, I decided to do my undergrad here at UBCO in the Human Kinetics department. So doing my undergrad in human kinetics really allowed me to develop a stronger understanding of the human body and the neuromuscular system. I started my Master's of Science in 2019, and I'll be finishing up here in the next few months. And then I'm also excited to say that will be starting my PhD here in the fall as well to continue some of the research that I've been able to start so far. Now into the presentation. I first want to talk about how Canadians are sleeping. So while recommendations for sleep quantity differ based on age, the current recommendation for adequate sleep for adults aged 18 to 64 is around 7 to 9 hours per night, while adults aged 65 and above should aim for about 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night. And even though we have these really nice sleep guides telling us how much sleep we need to get in order to optimize our energy and how we perform throughout the day, we know that 1 in 4 Canadian adults aren't getting enough sleep. We also see that 1 in 3 adults are having difficulty staying awake during waking hours. And finally, we know that 1 in 2 adults have trouble either going to sleep or staying asleep. And I myself know that I definitely fall into one of these categories, especially after daylight savings time. Each spring, I just always tend to be a little bit more tired. So I definitely find myself in one of these categories for sure. And so now that we know that a good portion of Canadians are experiencing some type of sleep loss, I wanted to talk about the three main kinds of sleep loss that we see in scientific literature. So the first and perhaps the least extreme type of sleep loss we see is called sleep disruption. Sleep disruption is also known as sleep fragmentation, and it's characterized by the interruption or fragmentation of otherwise normal sleep. This is commonly seen in sleep disorders such as sleep apnea or restless leg syndrome, and it can even happen simply if you or your partner may be experiencing snoring throughout the night. Sleep disruption is associated with increased awakenings throughout the night and typically results in a reduction in deep sleep, that deep restful sleep that we get, which is known to increase daytime sleepiness. The next type of sleep loss I want to talk about is sleep restriction. And sleep restriction is characterized by a reduction in sleep time below what is needed for optimal performance. So if you remember from a couple of minutes ago, for the average adult, the required sleep for optimal performance is anywhere between 7 and 9 hours per night. Sleep restriction is the most common form of sleep loss, and while most people will be fine after a short stint of sleep restriction, say for a night or two, chronic sleep restriction is when we start to see reductions in physical and mental capacities. And sleep restriction can be due to a variety of reasons, things like work, lifestyle, and any underlying medical conditions as well. And finally, and perhaps the most extreme form of sleep loss is total sleep deprivation. This is where we see a total elimination of sleep during a given period. For instance, someone pulling an all-nighter. Sleep deprivation is typically used to significantly prolong wakefulness. So for me, as a grad student, I immediately think of staying up all night to study. But this kind of sleep loss is also commonly seen in shift workers, including medical professionals and law enforcement. So the importance of sleep for our health is a very broad topic, and it can affect our minds and bodies in many different ways. Unfortunately, today I won't have time to cover all of them, so I've chosen to highlight a few ideas. For example, sleeping allows our brains to store new information, and it helps to solidify learning and memory. It also allows our nerve cells in our brain and our spinal cord and the rest of our body to better communicate and potentially reorganize themselves, and this supports healthy brain function. Lastly, sleep allows our body to repair cells and restore our energy sources. So all of these functions allow us to perform our activities of daily life in an optimal way. So now that we know the importance of sleep, I want to talk a little bit about what happens when we don't sleep. Again, there are lots of factors that are affected by sleep loss, so I've chosen to just highlight a few of them. So first, I'd like to talk about a study done by Hogan Kang, a master's student that graduated from our lab this past August. His study was focused on how 24 hours of total sleep deprivation affects young adults. And he found that in individuals after 24 hours of sleep deprivation, it showed significantly higher ratings of perceived fatigue and effort, which is shown in the graph here. So I don't know, I hope you guys can see my mouse moving around, but on the y-axis here, we have the numbers 0 through 10, and that represents a score or a rating of perceived exertion or effort. So the higher the number, the harder you feel like you're working. So we had these individuals go through about 20 minutes of an activity. And as you can see, the dots on the graph increase throughout the activity. Now, the white circles or the open circles here represent individuals that are well rested. They had a normal night of sleep, they're feeling good. The black circles, on the other hand, are individuals after 24 hours of sleep deprivation. And as you can see, throughout all 20 minutes of the activity, the sleep deprived individuals showed a higher rating of perceived exertion, meaning that they felt they were working harder and that they were having to use more effort to do the same activity compared to when they were well rested. And the last 10 minutes of the graph here, as you can see on the bottom, that's the recovery period. So that was just after they had finished the activity, we allowed them to rest and recover. And again, as you can see, the black dots representing the sleep deprived individuals didn't come down as low, meaning they were still feeling more tired and like they had a higher perception of fatigue than the well-rested counterparts. So to conclude, after 24 hours of sleep deprivation, my colleague Hogan found that a lack of sleep leads to increased perception of fatigue and effort in carrying out activities when compared to well-rested individuals. Another example that I wanted to touch on was two studies done by Al Haider and colleagues and Elisa and colleagues. Together, they showed that 24 hours of sleep deprivation significantly reduces short-term and long-term memory capacity. So on the graphs, the y-axis here has values 0 through 6. And these numbers represent the number of errors that individuals had on a memory test. So they completed a memory test called the RAWM, and the y-axis just represents the number of errors they made. So as you can see, the white bars here represent the control group. So again, individuals after a normal night of sleep. And on the gray bars represent individuals after a night of sleep deprivation. As you can see, the sleep deprived individuals had significantly more errors on the memory test, meaning that they had a significant reduction in their short-term and long-term memory. And that's just sort of a take-home message from that study. So as you can see, when we undergo sleep deprivation, our brain and our body show signs of reduced mental and physical capacities. While there is clear evidence surrounding how sleep deprivation affects some aspects of our functioning, like perceived fatigue and memory, there's limited research into how sleep deprivation might affect your balance, which is something a lot of researchers consider very important in maintaining health and preventing falls. So I'm going to take the next few slides to talk about balance before getting into how we went about researching sleep deprivation and balance in our lab. So I'd like to start talking first about before I start talking about standing balance, I'd like to first introduce some terms that are commonly involved in balance research. So first, center of mass is the point at which all of your mass or weight is concentrated. So in this diagram here, the center of mass is just represented by this small dot. And in most individuals, your center of mass is located approximately around your navel or your belly button. Next, your base of support is the area under your body, including all points of contact with the ground. So again, referring to this diagram, this little guy's base of support is shown here in red. And as you can see, as he widens his stance or his legs get wider, so does his base of support. So his base of support gets larger when his legs are further apart. And as you can imagine, by increasing your points of contact with the ground, say with a walking stick or a cane or a walker, the base of support further increases. So you can see here, this guy has a walking stick. His base of support is even larger. So by definition, standing balance is just the ability to maintain your center of mass within your base of support. So the larger your base of support, the easier it is to keep your center of mass within that area, and the easier it is to balance. Moving along, a couple more terms that I'd like to talk about quickly. Quiet stance refers to the period of time where an individual is standing still and there is no additional intentional movements. And even though we aren't consciously moving our bodies during quiet stance, there is still some small subconscious movements that happen. And this is referred to as sway, as you can see here. So sway is a totally normal aspect of standing balance. It happens in healthy individuals. Even in sort of the most ideal situation, you're still going to have some sway when you're standing in the quiet stance. So as you can see here in this video, this individual on the right is showing what sway looks like during quiet stance. Now the sway in this video is a little bit exaggerated just for us to be able to see it, but essentially, even when individuals are standing as still as possible, we still experience some sway. And having said that, even though a small amount of sway is normal, when we talk about sway in a research context, it's generally agreed upon that less sway suggests better balance, and vice versa. More sway or faster sway is indicative of worse balance. So now that we kind of understand what balance is and different concepts related to balance, I wanted to talk about what's actually happening in our bodies to allow us to stand properly, to allow us to have this proper standing balance. So first and foremost, we have information from 4 main senses that's integrated into our nervous system. So here we have our visual system, our auditory system. We have senses coming from our skin and our muscles throughout our body. And we also have our vestibular system, which I wanted to focus on a little bit more. So our vestibular system is located within our inner ear, and it helps us to sense where our head and our body is positioned in space. And it also helps us to sense how our head and our body is moving through space. So as you can imagine, this is a really important form of information that we're getting that will help us to maintain our proper standing balance. Now, when we have all of this sensory information, it's sent to our central nervous system, and then it's integrated in our brain. So our brain will take this sensory information, integrate it to give us a clear picture of how we're standing. And then our brain will be able to send an appropriate signal to our muscles to maintain that upright balance. So if your brain senses that maybe you're a little bit off balance, it'll be able to send the proper signal to your muscles to correct that. Now, when we see dysfunction in any one of these steps in the process, so if you can imagine sort of the sensory collection, it gets sent to our brain, it's integrated, and then the signal is sent to our muscles. You can think of that as sort of a 3-step process. So if you see dysfunction in any one of these steps, for example, if we were to see dysfunction within our vestibular system, this is when we start to see balance impairments. And coincidentally, and what I'll get into a little bit more later, is research shows that vestibular dysfunction is actually common through healthy human aging, and impairments in vestibular function is actually one of the specific reasons we tend to see balance impairments in older adults. So now, sort of on the topic of older adults and balance and perhaps falls, balance is a really important topic in the conversation of healthy aging, because with increased age, we tend to see development of balance impairments and a higher rate of falls, sort of how I mentioned, such that 20 to 30% of older adults fall each year. And related to that, falls are actually the leading cause of injury in older adults and can lead to further health complications. So there are a few physiological factors that are related to this impaired balance we see in older adults, including a reduction in muscle mass and strength. So as you can see in this figure here, strength on the y-axis in just an arbitrary unit, so the higher the number, the more strength you have, is actually shown to decrease through the lifespan. So you can see both males and females will experience a reduction in strength throughout their life. Also, with increased age, as I mentioned before, we tend to see a decrease in proper vestibular function, which is shown in this figure here. So I'll take a minute to explain this figure as it's a little bit tricky. But what we see here is on the y-axis, the y-axis just represents the amplitude of our vestibular response. We have young adults on the left, older adults on the right. And what we can see is that older adults compared to young adults have an increase in the vestibular response. And while an increased response may sound like a good thing, oftentimes when we see an increase in vestibular responses, it tends to be accompanied by an overreaction in our balance response. Meaning for the same vestibular activity being seen in older and younger adults, that higher vestibular response will lead to an overreaction in balance, which is potentially leading to a greater fall risk. Now that it's clear, hopefully, how important standing balance is across the lifespan, I want to discuss a research study that I did during my master's, looking at how sleep deprivation affects balance. So because we know that sleep deprivation is a fairly common condition, as I highlighted at the beginning of the presentation, and we know that balance is really important in maintaining healthy living and preventing falls, that's where I wanted to focus my research. So my master's thesis was focused on how 24 hours of sleep deprivation affected standing balance in young adults. So this figure on the left shows our experimental setup. We had individuals come into the lab on 2 separate occasions. So once following a normal night of sleep, and then once following 24 hours of total sleep deprivation. We had the individuals stand on a force sensor that using this force sensor, we were able to measure the sway that they experienced when they stand. And we were also recording muscle activity during the periods of standing balance that we had the individuals do. So the main result I wanted to talk about is shown in these figures on the right. The red line represents our vestibular responses following a night of sleep deprivation, and the blue lines show our vestibular responses when participants were well rested. Essentially, anytime the red line is higher than the blue line, it means we are seeing an increased sensitivity to our vestibular system. So as I mentioned before, if we have an increased sensitivity to our vestibular system and we're seeing these increased vestibular responses, it often leads to the same overreaction response in our balance, which can lead to a greater fall risk. So sort of the take-home message from my study that I completed is that sleep deprivation causes higher sensitivity to our vestibular system, leading to an overreaction to this vestibular activity, which can lead to a greater fall risk. Now, another study that I wanted to talk about that's sort of related to the study that I did was conducted by researchers in Quebec, and they were investigating similar information, looking at how sleep deprivation affected postural control, with the additional aspect of looking into how age altered the effects. So as you can see on these graphs, the y-axis just shows the speed at which these individuals swayed. And as I mentioned before, generally, increased sway speed is associated with poorer balance. So on the left of each of these graphs is the value that these individuals had after a night of normal sleep. And on the right, it shows it shows the speed of sway in these individuals after a night of sleep deprivation. So again, the same 24 hours of sleep deprivation. And they showed that the speed at which individuals sway when they're standing changes with sleep deprivation, and it actually gets faster or worse in older adults. So as you can see here, going from a night of normal sleep to a night of sleep deprivation, these individuals were swaying faster, which is associated with worse balance. So these researchers concluded that in older adults, the impairments we see in balance in young adults following sleep deprivation is actually exacerbated. Therefore, they also concluded that sleep loss is a significant risk factor for falling, especially in older adults. So again, just another take-home message. With sleep deprivation, we saw impaired balance, and in the older adults, we saw that their balance was even further impaired. So all of the research I've looked at so far and all of the research I've been fortunate enough to be involved with has only left me with more questions. So I quickly wanted to talk about some future research that our lab is planning on conducting over the next few years. So this past year, our lab gained an awesome new PhD student, Lisa, as you can see here. And her studies over the next few years will potentially be focusing on more acute levels of sleep loss. So more towards the idea of sleep disruption or sleep restriction compared to the total sleep deprivation that I've been talking about. And then as far as what sort of aspects of human function she's looking at, she wants to look at different aspects of neurological and muscular functioning in young and older adults. So after hearing all of these pretty negative things about how sleep can impact your balance, the one question I'm sure at least a couple of you have right now is, okay, great, so what do I do about it? So I'd like to turn it around a little bit and talk about some healthy habits that you can implement into your daily routine to hopefully get a better sleep. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to break it down and focus on healthy daily habits and healthy sleep habits. Before I get into the suggestions and sort of the habits that I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides, I'm going to preface it by saying that not all of these things will work perfectly for everybody, depending on your current sleep habits, any underlying medical conditions, your physical activity levels, etc. But they are some helpful tips that have been shown to help the average person. So to start off, some healthy habits that you can implement into your daily routine include avoiding alcohol, caffeine, and nicotine before bed. While alcohol has been shown to potentially help you fall asleep more quickly, it actually increases mental arousal levels throughout the night. And this possibly leads to more sleep fragmentation and a reduction in that deep, restful sleep that we want. And as far as caffeine and nicotine go, they're both stimulants, making it harder for your body and your mind to relax to the point of going to sleep and staying asleep. The next tip, and probably my favorite, is that exercising regularly has been shown to improve sleep quality in individuals with sleep disturbances. And it's actually been shown to be the most helpful in improving sleep in older adults more than any other population of people. This exercise can include sports, it can be more focused on a structured exercise routine, or it can be something as simple as just taking your dog for a walk. The next tip is practicing relaxation and mindfulness techniques, because these have been shown to reduce mental arousal levels before sleep, making it easier to fall asleep and easier to stay asleep. And the last helpful tip that I wanted to talk about is to remember to review your medications with your doctor regularly. It's been shown that lots of common medications have the ability to disrupt sleep. So it's important to keep up with what you're taking and having that conversation with your physician. For the healthy sleep habits, sort of to complete the other half of the equation, there are some habits you can do to improve your quantity and quality of sleep. So first, maintaining a regular bedtime and wake time. So this just means going to bed and waking up at around the same time every day. This will help to regulate your own circadian rhythms, which essentially just means that it will allow the hormones in your body associated with sleeping and waking up to increase and decrease at the appropriate times throughout the day to help you go to sleep and wake up easier. The next tip is to reduce noise in the sleeping environment. And this is just to allow you to remain in that deep sleep for longer, and have it be less likely to get that sleep fragmentation and less awakenings throughout the night. The last tip is, if you do find yourself having naps throughout the day, try to restrict those to about 30 minutes. It's been shown that napping for longer than that can potentially disrupt your nighttime sleep as well. Next slide. So that brings us to the end of my presentation. I'm looking at my watch and it went quite quickly, but that's okay. I just want to thank everyone that I've been able to work and do research with over the past few years, many of whom are in this photo, some of whom are not. I'd really like to thank all of our participants we get into the lab to do this research. Obviously not so much lately, but our research really wouldn't be able to go anywhere without having some really awesome people who are willing to help us further our knowledge. I want to thank NSERC, my funding agency, and especially today, I want to thank Joan and Jaquetta at UBCO and the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention and Valley First, for organizing this great month of events for Okanagan Embrace Aging and for allowing me to be a part of it. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of you who joined me today to have a discussion about the importance of sleep and the impact it can have on your balance. Thanks.
Great. That was wonderful, Paige. Thank you so much. Lots to think about there for sure.
Yeah, lots of information.
Yeah, lots of information. It was great. And we have some time for questions and comments. So I encourage you to put those in the chat box for us. And we already have a couple of questions that I'm going to read out. The first question is from Beverly. Bad headaches waking up, I think wake up me during the night and AM. May I know what you would suggest? Stress activated and trauma from years ago. So the treatments aren't really working. Thanks for all your education sharing to all. So yeah, the issue of bad headaches, keeping people awake. What do you think?
I'm going to preface me answering these questions just by saying I'm not a physician. So I don't want to be giving any medical advice that is being taken sort of for true. But if I just quickly go back to some of these daily habits, obviously I'm not sure what your daily habits are. I don't know sort of what your day-to-day is, but really practicing sort of any of these daily habits for headaches and the fact that you mentioned that they might be more stress induced, I would really recommend focusing on practicing relaxation and mindfulness techniques. So this could be anywhere from meditating to just taking a few minutes throughout your day, and especially before you go to bed, to really just sort of bring your thoughts and bring your mind to the activity of going to sleep. As far as how they might influence sort of the level of your headache, I'm not totally sure. If your prescriptions and your medications maybe aren't working, I think just reopening up that conversation with your physician and trying to find maybe an alternative route to help you might be the best way to go with that.
Great, thank you. Here's another question. If one works at night, so I'm assuming like on a night shift, does the sleep they get during the day make up for it? And does that person get the same benefit from daytime sleep? So this is really about the shift workers, I think, who end up sleeping during the day.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm sure that at least a few people probably on this call had the same question. I know I've got a lot of people in my life who are shift workers, and they are constantly having to switch between working during the day and then potentially working at night. And that tends to be where some of these issues with sleep loss comes in, is when you're constantly having to transition between sleeping at like during the day and then sleeping at night. But if an individual has established a routine of working at night and sleeping during the day, that quality of sleep that they'll get during the day isn't necessarily going to be any poorer than the sleep they'll get at night, if that makes sense. So if they're established in their routine, they're able to set sort of consistent bedtimes and wake times. It shouldn't make that much of a difference. They should still be able to benefit from the daytime sleep.
Right. Yeah, one thing that we heard from men, who are working in male-dominated workplaces where they were working shift, like, coal mine industry and things like that, then where the coal mine or the gold mine works 24 hours a day, many of them were working shift. And some of these men talked about, joining this workforce and not getting any tips about how to actually sleep during the day. And we're really wanting some tips from people who are experienced in shift work during in their workplaces. And so I think there's some benefit that people could share a lot of information among shift workers about what works and doesn't work, and people can try them out. But the other thing that they commented about was, especially in these camps, was the kind of meals that were provided. So it's like they were getting off night shift and the cafeteria was offering this big breakfast kind of meal, and then they were going to go to bed, and somehow it wasn't working for them. So it's especially in these camp situations where people are working shift, it's interesting to think about how they fit their meals in around their sleep patterns as well to enhance sleep, because I don't think you want a big meal just before you go to sleep. Is that right?
That tends to be the thought. The research behind sort of meal time throughout the day and how that's related to your sleep schedule is a little bit fuzzy. There tends to be a little, like, not quite a consensus around that. But in general, yeah, having sort of a huge meal right before you go to bed doesn't tend to lead to very good sleep.
Yeah. All right, there's a question here from Penelope: to help increase strength to prevent quiet stance sway and improve balance, what type of exercise would you recommend? Weights, pilates, something? What would help?
That is another great question, and actually one that I thought I might get. So I'm happy to be able to talk about this a little bit more. So thanks for the question, Penelope. As far as increasing strength goes, to potentially improve balance, most of the research does tend to show that sort of weight-based training, or more of the strength training, shows better results. And when I say strength training, I don't mean like you're in the gym just bench pressing like hundreds of pounds. Like, you don't have to be doing that to get the benefits. It can be body weight exercises. So Pilates, like you said, is a great one. Things like yoga and Tai Chi actually have been shown to really improve individuals' balance, and that's not just through strengthening. Well, of course, you're going to be getting the strengthening benefits from those exercises. Those sort of in and of themselves help to improve your balance, just because you're put into more of these posture challenging positions. So those tend to be quite beneficial to improve your balance. And then as far as, I mean, the cool thing about exercise, especially related to the talk that I just gave, so talking about both balance and sleep, and the fact that exercise has been shown to improve both aspects of those, right? So if you start exercising a little bit more, not only are you going to reap the benefits from a balance perspective, you're going to be able to, improve your sleep, have a deeper sleep, and then by improving your sleep, it's also going to improve your balance. So it really is sort of a double whammy, if you will, as far as the benefits that you can get from exercise. And I guess just to sort of go back and say, I don't necessarily think there's one specific exercise that you can do that will sort of be like the gold standard, the best exercise. My suggestion Having taken sort of a kinesiology degree and taken things like exercise psychology and stuff like that, is just find something that you enjoy doing, right? So, I mean, I was having this conversation with my lab mates earlier today, but if someone were to tell me that to improve my balance and to improve my sleep, I had to go for an hour-long run every day, like, I'm just being realistic. That's probably not going to happen. I'm not a runner. I don't like running. So I'm probably not going to reap the benefits from that. But if the same person were to tell me I could go for a hike or take my dog for a walk and get those same benefits, I'm obviously going to be a lot more likely to do that. So Penelope, after all of that long-winded explanation, I think just finding an exercise that you genuinely like doing, and doing it to the point of, getting a bit of a sweat on, getting your heart rate up. I think that's where you'll really be able to sort of reap the benefits.
That's great. So in those studies that you were doing in your lab and those of others, you talked about comparing people who had normal sleep and then sleep deprivation. And so I guess I'm wondering, how sleep deprivation was defined? Like, did you try and keep somebody awake all night for one night? Is that what sleep deprivation meant for that subject?
Yeah, believe it or not, well, for sure, at least in the study that I was a part of, and a couple of the studies I mentioned, it was just 24 hours of total sleep deprivation. I can't speak for the other studies, but the study that I was involved in, we had individuals come into the lab twice. So once sort of just a normal morning after they had their regular night of sleep. And then the second time that they came in, we essentially just kept them up all night. We had individuals in the lab who kind of like stuck around after school ended as supervisors, and we stayed up all night. It was definitely something. I'm definitely an individual that cherishes my sleep. I need my sleep. So it was really interesting to see sort of the effects of that 24 hours of sleep deprivation on different individuals.
Yeah. So I wonder, that's interesting because then that gives me two questions. It says, I'm wondering, that's in a lab situation where someone has had no sleep for 24 hours. But most of us have some disrupted sleep from time to time, or maybe even every night. But we do sleep a few hours, but it's not like the 7 or whatever that we're required to sleep. So if it's reduced sleep as opposed to no sleep over 24 hours, do you think we would get the same issues related to balance? Or is it only when people don't have any sleep that they increase their fall risk?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think that's sort of if I'm being honest, it's sort of the question that's at the center of a lot of this sleep deprivation research. Is sort of looking at shift workers aside, because obviously there are individuals that are going through these periods of total sleep deprivation, but for the average individual, it is more so the sleep sort of restriction or these small disruptions throughout the night. The only thing with focusing our research on that kind of sleep loss is it's a lot harder to control, unfortunately. So we could have individual A who, say, gets 5 hours of sleep a night, and individual B who also gets 5 hours of sleep a night. But the actual sleep loss that they experience could be totally different. So
Right.
one person could just be going to sleep too late and waking up too early, whereas another individual might go to sleep at the quote right time, but then wake up a few times throughout the night. So it does sort of pose a problem when it comes to controlling the experiments. But hopefully in the next few years, Lisa, our PhD student who's going to focus more so on that kind of sleep loss, will be able to answer some of those questions. There's definitely research out there on it, but it's nowhere near as much, just based on the challenges within research.
Right. Yes, I imagine to do that research, you'd almost need a really sophisticated sleep lab
Yeah,
to actually
absolutely.
measure people's sleep during the night and accurately estimate how much sleep they got in various sleep stages. And
Yeah, and there certainly are like sleep clinics where people will go in and stay overnight to sort of track how they sleep throughout the night. So yeah, I suppose maybe almost teaming up with a sleep clinic like that might be the best way to go about doing that. But yeah, there's
yeah,
certainly ways to do it, but it's definitely much harder.
yeah, yeah. And I guess the other thing I wondered is, this, your research and that of others is often after one night of sleep deprivation. And so it makes me wonder, what happens after, days and weeks of lack of sleep. And maybe it's not total deprivation, but sleep restriction over days and weeks and months, and how over time that might, the consequences might accumulate or not. I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's definitely sort of the idea of habituation or sort of the ability to adapt to getting a reduced amount of sleep. Um, like I know I can speak for my mom. She is sort of the kind of person that says like, "Oh, I only need like 4 or 5 hours a night and I'm fine." Whereas I know if I were to start only sleeping 4 to 5 hours a night, I would certainly feel the effects. So there's definitely the concept of habituation or adaptation to getting of like whether that be just less sleep or maybe more interrupted sleep. Um, so it kind of gets to the point of trying to figure out how this adaptation occurs while also still having to consider what the long-term effects are of having that interrupted sleep. And I mentioned earlier in the presentation that the average person can like will generally be fine after having a few nights of maybe not the best sleep. They'll be able to recover. Um, but yeah, it's definitely an interesting question to see what would happen if that were to persist for a long period of time, whether or not the sort of consequences would outweigh the adaptation that might occur.
Mhm. Yeah, and obviously we know there's a lot of other conditions that are associated with inadequate sleep, other chronic diseases, including diabetes and other things like that. So it's associated with a number of chronic diseases in addition to falls. It's sounding like.
Yeah, it's definitely a very far-reaching condition.
Yeah.
And it gets to the point I feel like sometimes it's hard to be able to sort of tell almost like the chicken and the egg idea. Like, are you experiencing maybe these symptoms because of your lack of sleep, or are you experiencing this lack of sleep because of your symptoms? It's definitely sort of
Yeah.
a hard thing to navigate at that point. But I mean, hopefully, if you're able to implement some of these healthy like daily and sleep habits, you're able to get past a little bit of it, hopefully.
Yeah. Yes, I think the issue of sleep is an important one for people of all ages, actually. Um, we have a faculty member in nursing looking at sleep with children and families and trying to get infants to sleep and young children. And so I know that many young parents have many sleepless nights. And so it's an issue that cuts across all ages, I think. And perhaps one that we really haven't given the same focus as we do exercise, healthy diet, that kind of thing. I think it probably needs to be right up there with the other forms of that we focus on for healthy lifestyles.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think just within the last couple of years, I think it was just quite recently, CSEP with like CSEP puts out their activity guidelines,
Mhm.
right? So how much exercise and what kind of exercise you should be getting throughout the day. And they just recently included sort of a sleep portion of their healthy living guidelines. So that was really cool to see sort of a bigger organization acknowledging how important sleep is for healthy living in general.
Yeah, that's great. It's great. Well, this has really been a wonderful presentation and a great discussion about the importance of sleep on World Sleep Day, which is even better. It's a day we should all be refocusing on the importance of sleep. So I'm wondering if I don't see any more comments or questions in the chat box. So I'm wondering if you have any sort of final words of advice or final closing comments you'd like to give to us and our audience.
Yeah. So hopefully throughout this sort of discussion, we were just able to I've helped you understand the importance of sleep and provided some tips to hopefully improve your sleep. As we know, it's very important for various aspects of health. Obviously, me being a balance researcher, I like to focus on ways we can improve sleep to improve our balance, and whether that be different healthy habits you can implement throughout your day, or healthy sleep habits you can implement at night. Hopefully we can just all start to get better sleeps.
That's great. Yes, what a good idea. Thank you so much, Paige, for sharing your research and these words of wisdom about how to get better sleep. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us today, and hope you have a chance to come back to one of our other Embrace Aging events before the end of the month. You can check out what's remaining on our website. And best of all, I hope you all have some great sleep over the weekend. So thanks again. Bye for now.